for joining us today. We have a very special treat for you this afternoon as we are bringing to you one of our favorite professors, Emil Pitkin, from our statistics department. I'm going to turn things over to him in just a moment, but before I do so, I want to provide a brief bio on Emil. So Emil teaches MBA statistics and is the 2018 winner of the Anvil Award, which is the highest honor given to Wharton instructors, as well as multiple Wharton, Penn, and Harvard teaching prizes. He earned his doctorate in statistics at Wharton after receiving his BA in mathematics from Harvard. He founded and led GovPredict, a political software company, until its successful exit in 2020. And Emil serves on the boards of the Government Relations Association and of Pro-Israel America and was born in St. Petersburg, Russia. So for the next hour, we're going to turn things over to Emil. You are in great hands and we hope you enjoy his class.
Jen, thank you so much for the introduction and thank you so much for the opportunity to spend an hour with the next generations of captains of whatever field you decide to captain. I'd like to begin with a note of congratulations to all of you in this lecture here. If you can take a measure of a person by how he or she distinguishes him or herself from the rest, from the crowd, then certainly being granted admission to Wharton is the highest measure that can be attained. This will be my 8th year running teaching at Wharton. And I would never consider teaching anywhere else simply because of the caliber and the quality and the intensity and the talent and the, let's say, personal character of the students who make up the Wharton community. So congratulations to all of you. No small feat, no mean feat to be in the Wharton umbrella. And I share my admiration for you. So that there can be an additional note of humanity injected into our all too brief interaction today, those of you who are not uncomfortable doing this, can you please turn on your video so that we can speak with each other and not just with some names on a panel? And 1,000 Wharton points to Rohan, who was the quickest on the uptake. I hope I get to teach you next semester. Let me tell you about the purpose of statistics at Wharton and the purpose of our hour together. When we were in high school and when we were in college, we were taught certain formulas, z-tests, t-tests, p-values, and we regurgitated them and we crammed for exams, and all of you, since you're here, did extremely well. But as you know, that there's a gulf between strictly academic and what can support your work in the world as it is. And that's the purpose of statistics at Wharton. My holy writ is to prepare you and to prepare students to be knowledgeable consumers of numbers as they are presented, to be wary and savvy when numbers are misrepresented, either through malice or through ignorance, and to equip you with the techniques and the knowledge and the capabilities of translating numbers that might have been presented to you in raw form into a compelling story. What we're going to do today is, through a series of cases, through a series of examples out in the wild, work together to understand why what appears is not as it is, why there is a difference between, let's say, the epidermis, the appearance, and the actual heart of the matter. We're going to see why, if we think with the fast part of our brains and not the slow ones, if we don't employ the tools of statistics, why we'll simply be bamboozled, misled, and led astray. And the glory of being a Wharton student is that we are not misled, we're not led astray, but we can pursue and attain truth in all of its glory. Without further ado, I'd like to share with you some data which the New York City municipality publishes every month about the crime in New York City. Just to get a sense, is anybody here from New York? Are we speaking with any New Yorkers? Or who's visited New York, has heard of New York? Okay, this is for all of you. This is for all of you then, and let me share my screen. Actually, I'm going to unshare my screen. Rules of the road for our time together. If you have something to say, say it. This is not meant to be a dry and definitive lecture. This is meant to be just like class is. I think a rowdy and colorful dialogue. And if you have something to say, you're welcome either to say it like a human being or to write it in the chat. It's your choice. So let me go and let me share my screen. I'm also going to paste the link in the chat so that you can play around with it yourself. What do we have? We have the 5 boroughs broken out into census precincts. So we have the New York City, we have New York City, all of its 5 boroughs. And you can see it's subdivided into smaller areas. So first, we already learned something. The way in which the data are presented here is in the form of a heat map, a very typical, usually very helpful way of visualizing the intensity of some activity. And the activity here that we are visualizing is crime in different areas of New York City. And to the credit of the New York City government, you don't hear that phrase very often, but to the credit of the New York City government, they are visualizing for citizens and residents' benefit which parts of the city are most dangerous, which parts of the city would you perhaps not want to set foot in. So those of you who know New York City, well, in this heat map, the darker the red, the more intense the color, the more intense the crime. What part of New York City seems to be the most crime-ridden? You can just say it or type it out. What's this part of Manhattan? What do we call it?
Midtown.
Yeah, it's Midtown. The implication being as soon as you, step out of Penn Station, recently renovated, you're going to get mugged, right? That's the story that I read from this map. Except this is not the experience that New York City residents or those who have known New York City are typically subject to. Midtown Manhattan, we know, or we think we know, is not the most dangerous area of New York City. So how can it be that Midtown, so Times Square, Penn Station, Business District, why does that appear to be? Why do the data seem to tell us, remember, data is the truth, why do data seem to tell us that Midtown Manhattan is the most dangerous? So Andrew, I see that you raised a hand, but before we do this, I'm going to send you into breakout rooms, groups of 5, and we'll give you a good 3 minutes to talk to each other, play around with the map, and answer the question, why do we see this discrepancy between intuition, which is that some parts of the Bronx or Brooklyn should be the most dangerous, and what appears to be fact, Midtown Manhattan. So let's create some breakout rooms. And you guys will have 3 minutes. Let's make it 4 minutes to discuss it all. Talk amongst yourselves. Whoever's comfortable can share with the group. You guys have 4 minutes. Let's go. And we are back. I hope a little bit more enlightened than we were a couple minutes ago. Who would like to speak? Who would like to talk about this apparent discrepancy between what we expect and what the data appear to tell us? Just, no need to be polite. I prefer just aggressively cutting to the front of the line. So if you'd like to speak, just speak.
So breakout group 4, we surmise that there are very few people who live in Midtown Manhattan, so it has a very small denominator, and that is why it looks more dangerous than elsewhere.
My only regret is, actually, regret is a strange way of putting it, is that this group is so intelligent that I didn't have the opportunity to go through some other variables of lesser importance, but still of interest, to be able to build up to this great insight. But seeing as the group is very savvy, let's talk about what you said first. Really, really nicely done. One of the first principles, actually the only principle that I demand of all the students, and that I hope that you will carry with you for the rest of your life, is principle number 1, which is that you must always look at the data. You must always look at the data, not merely how it is presented to you. You must always look at how the data are converted from raw to visual. And you're absolutely right. If you look at the legend, it says that we are looking at crimes per 1,000 residents by precinct. And if you know something about New York City, you know that not so many people, individuals, private individuals, pay rent or own property in Midtown Manhattan. There is an extraordinary crush of people there. There are tourists, there are businesses, there used to be restaurants, hotels, what have you. There are plenty of individuals, human beings, but not many residents at all. Not many people who pay individual property tax, residential property tax. And so when we're looking at crimes per 1,000 residents, Camille, is that how I pronounce your name?
Yep, that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, you were absolutely right. When you're looking at crimes per 1,000 residents, there will be a deflated denominator. There will be a low number of residents in Midtown Manhattan. And so what happens when you take any number and divide it by a small number? You're going to arrive at a large number. So we should not be surprised that there is a large number of crimes per a small number of residents in Midtown Manhattan. And that is the original sin of the way in which this map is presented. But let's not just content ourselves with pointing out flaws. Let's talk about happy solutions. If you're really trying to paint a picture of the criminality of an area, how could you do it? Instead of looking at crimes per 1,000 residents, how could you more accurately portray how dangerous a particular precinct is in? Anybody who wants to speak, just jump in.
Maybe crime per number of people there during the day.
I agree with you. Number of people, in a sense, if somebody's there during a day, well, I would say night as well. So you mean a 24-hour period.
24 hours, yeah.
Okay. If somebody is there during a day, then they have an opportunity to have crime committed against them. So you want to know how many crimes divided by the number of opportunities. Let's go one step further. Theoretically, I agree with you. Practically, how are you going to measure? If you're going to collect, you have to measure. How are you going to measure the number of people who happen to pass through a particular area in a day?
I think you can actually estimate that very accurately in New York City. We have data on subway. We have data on people traveling by train. We have also...
So subway and train, that's all nice and good, but there are parts of New York City which are not serviced by subway and train that could still have a good deal of traffic. So now you are being accurate in some places at the cost of inaccuracy elsewhere. Where would you go next? Let's have somebody else step in.
How about like Google tracks locations, and there are like legal ways to report that without personally identifiable information, so you can.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice idea. Some like cell phone tower pings, and though not everybody has a cell phone, at a certain point you need to tip your hat to reality. Some form of location tracking is probably the surest way we have of estimating traffic in a particular area. Absolutely. You could have drone footage if you really thought it important to measure flow in a particular area as well. Okay, so we've learned about one misrepresentation of the data. Again, to the credit of New York City, this is the best that they could do with the data that they had, and they were honest about what was measured and how it was presented. But it's your responsibility to look at that fine print to understand the meaning of this data. Let's go further. Not all crime is created equal. I would much rather have my pockets picked than to be feloniously assaulted. That's my preference. You may have other preferences. Let's look at what is meant by the definition crime. And if you look into, I'm sharing my screen, right? You can see what I'm doing? Can you see what I'm doing?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we can.
If we're looking at crime type, you can see that all types of crime have been mashed together. But that doesn't allow us to answer very specific questions. Where, for example, should you not go if you fear for your life? Well, let's look at murder itself. Now, if you look at murder, you can see that Midtown Manhattan is as good as it gets. And there are other areas. Is this Brooklyn? Brooklyn?
I think that's Queens.
Queens? Yeah.
Like
so,
Rockaway. Yeah.
Queens. So places where you should not go. So it turns out that mashing together different subgroups can conceal rather than reveal. Early during the pandemic, for example, we saw that blacks had lower mortality rates than whites, which people went to investigate. Why is that the case? But then if you want to look at every single decade of life, people in their 60s, people in their 70s, people in their 80s, you could see that whites had lower mortality rates than blacks in every single decade. So the question is, how could you have one demographic with lower mortality rate for every time of life and yet overall have a higher mortality rate? If we're trying to understand differential impact, if we're trying to understand discrepancy in health outcomes, then we would be misled if we simply looked at overall mortality rates. And the explanation is there happen to be more whites that are in their 90s and their 80s and their 70s. People who are old are more likely to succumb to COVID. That's the primary determinant. So if you look at the very large number of, let's say, whites in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, that takes the overall mortality rate and raises it. But if you were to be in any single subgroup, then the mortality rate is higher amongst blacks. And that is what is concealed if you look at overall percentages, overall numbers. That is what was concealed if we simply looked at all crimes across all of New York City. Does anybody have a favorite crime that you'd like to look at and so develop a reputation for the next 2 years? Let's look at felony assault. Again, felony assault, well, that's where Midtown Manhattan, where you don't want to be. Again, subject to our observation that per 1,000 residents is not the way to measure how dangerous it is to be in a particular area. And again, we can keep looking and see that grand larceny or motor vehicle, even though there aren't that many people who live in Midtown, still it's much safer than in other places that are more residential, which makes sense. There are more vehicles that could be stolen. What else? Let's look at the date range. This is just looking at one particular month. Maybe there are different effects in all of 2019. It turns out that no. It turns out that there's no variability that's temporal, but there could have been, and it's your responsibility to look at those other time ranges as well, from which we derive a corollary that any time that the New York Times or Washington Post or any major publication says, since February of 2017, it is not arbitrary why they say since February of 2017. Why not March? Why not January? Because if you go back to February 2017 or March 2019, whatever it is, there will likely be the strongest effect. So just remember that seemingly arbitrary choices in time-based reporting, very rarely arbitrary. Therefore, your responsibility to look at the data. Are there any other observations or questions that you would like to propose or ask about this particular case? So we'll take a 5-second pause. And can you describe in words, if it's possible to describe in words, how you felt when you got admitted to Wharton? I'm just curious. Just put it in the chat. Before anybody wrote anything, I thought it was numb because nobody was writing anything, but it seems that everybody had feelings. So here is my blessing for you. I hope that that feeling that you experienced at the moment of admission, to some degree, will follow you for the next 2 years. Because those of you who talk about excitement and feeling of surreality and elation, those are the feelings that should accompany you in this educational journey. So let's proceed. As you know, there are many news articles that begin with the word Florida man, and for good reason. Florida is a state unlike any other. Wall Street Journal had an article, when was this? A couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, about the most dangerous place to bike in America. And each of these little blocks represents the risk of mortality from cycling. And just with your eyes, you can see that of all the states, Florida seems to be the one where you should not go if you want to cycle and expect to live. Again, Wall Street Journal, to their credit, they're giving us a numerical summary. We can see that the number of deaths per 100,000 people, Florida way, way, way above all of the rest, followed by the others. Let me put this in the chat. And this time you will have 2 minutes. And I would like you to talk amongst yourselves about whether you should indeed avoid Florida, or whether there's something else that could potentially be at play. So let's go into breakout rooms. You guys will have 2 minutes. And try to explain the numbers as they are. Try to explain the image as it is. Ready, set, and go. The floor is open, the opportunity is yours. What's the effect that we're seeing here? What explains all this red in Florida and Louisiana? What makes it so dangerous to bike there, aside from all of the geriatric drivers?
One thing we talked about is just weather. So places that are nicer to bike are more likely to have larger volumes of people and hence more accidents. And
Yeah, so it turns out that talking about the weather is not simply a polite way to begin a conversation, but can sometimes reveal the profound effects in a major Wall Street Journal expose. I agree with you. Where it is warm, people tend to cycle. And it is warm in Florida, it is warm in Louisiana, it is warm in the Carolinas, it is warm in California. We have this strange one in Monroe, Michigan, where it's probably not so warm, but in general, it seems to be most dangerous when it's warm. Somebody else, take this one step further. A lot of people bike where it is warm, and
they're tourists. So, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
We were talking about how there are a lot of tourists in the area, so they're unfamiliar with where they were biking. And I actually lived in Jacksonville, where you would notice people are just paying attention to the coast and they're just not really looking at the road. They're a little distracted.
So that is a potential explanation, to be sure. I will, again, with all respect to Lumberton, North Carolina, which I'm sure is a lovely place, it's not known for its tourist attractions, nor would I say Hammond, Louisiana. So that might contribute to a particular area, but not necessarily the overall effect, but a contributing factor for sure. There was somebody else who was speaking. Was it Michelle?
Yeah, I was going to say another thing we talked about is that the data is showing the deaths per 100,000 people, but that doesn't give us any idea of how many people are actually biking.
Yep.
You know, how of the bicyclists who are actually getting into accidents.
Very, very well done. The reason that this case followed the first is because the effect is the same, where the improper denominator, the improper presentation gives us a mistaken sense. This is bicycle deaths per 100,000 people in an area, not per bikers. You really want to know, if you hop on a bike, how dangerous is it? How many bikers are there that could be the victims of an unfortunate accident? And nowhere here do we have anything about cycling traffic. And so, just as Emil said, it's warm. There are lots of people who are cycling around, independent of the pet population in the area. So something to keep in mind, which makes the Monroe, Michigan that much more interesting, because it is a cold weather area where still the fatalities are unusually high. So I would focus there and try to understand. And perhaps, Angela, I don't know if it's a touristy area or the roads are poor or if they're beautiful vistas, but there's clearly something else there separate from the weather effect, which is really what's driving the majority of these deep red squares. And I bring this to you because the Wall Street Journal is as honorable a publication as there is that really does attempt to paint an honest picture of the world. And again, they were honest about how they displayed the data, and still there can be the strongest of limitations even in the most respected of publications. So I hope you still haven't lost all faith in anything that you read, but that you become just a little bit more wary, a little bit more vigilant. Let's move on to the next case. I'm curious in the chat if you could please put how you feel about bacon, and feel free to include purple prose if purple prose is warranted. How does the incoming class of 2023 feel about bacon? I happen not to eat it, so I would like to live vicariously through those who feel strongly about it. Great to eat while snowboarding. Delimish almost good on anything. Fantastic on donuts. Okay, so we can see that it's a very versatile meal, beloved by many Americans and citizens of the world. Maybe not a universal delight, but certainly something that many people enjoy. For those of you who feel strongly and positively about bacon, I have very unfortunate news for you. Which is that eating just one slice of bacon a day is linked to a higher risk of colorectal cancer. So I'm trying to protect you. Well, let's read a little bit further. Let me post this here. Read a little further. Eating even a moderate amount of red or processed meat is linked with an increased risk of colorectal cancer. People who ate 76 grams of red and processed meat per day had a 20% higher chance of developing colorectal cancer. Wow. Wow. I'm going to ask you to split up into groups, take 3 minutes to discuss and talk about whether what you have just learned in this article is enough to sway you. If you love bacon, to cut back. If you don't eat it but have friends who do, to share the gospel, share the good news that there are alternatives, because bacon itself, or red and processed meat, contributes in a major way to the risk of cancer. Well, let's talk about it. Is 20% a very high increase? Is it something that concerns you? Is it something that would warrant some behavioral adjustment? So you have the facts. You have the facts. Make some decisions based on the facts. Let's go to the breakout rooms. You guys will have 3 minutes. Please discuss. I already feel an affinity for this group, so I will call you team. So team, what have we come up with? How does this change or not change our attitude towards bacon?
I think it's important to know the absolute value of the probability. Like what exactly is the base value so that we can say whether 20% increase is significant or not.
Manji, I also hope that you will be in my class next semester, because you are absolutely right. And what I really like about what you said, you talk about the baseline. One of the critical ideas, simple once you know it, simple once you've heard it, simple once you've thought about it once, but not obvious at first. The idea of the baseline relative to what we're thinking about increases. And so for the team's benefit from cancer.org, the risk of colorectal cancer is about 4%, very similar for men and for women. So the idea is that whatever you do, there's about a 4% risk of developing colorectal cancer. Now, if you also happen to gluttonously eat 2 slices or a slice of bacon, by the way, this is an extra slice of bacon a day, every single day for the rest of your life. Just imagine how much meat that is. This is not 1 slice of bacon. This is 1 slice of bacon a day consistently. And you have to think about that as well. But that increases the risk from 4% to 20% higher than 4%. So that increases the risk from about 4 to 5%, to use round numbers. And I can't answer the question for you, but you can, whether the risk of increasing a specific kind of cancer from 4% to 5%, so 1 percentage point increase, for the joy that some of you feel for having bacon, whether it's worth reducing that risk to the baseline by 1 percentage point, right, to give up that behavior. Again, I can't answer the question, but I can suggest that that is a productive alternative to simply thinking about the relative change of 20% increase. We talk in statistics of effect size, which is how much larger did the effect become. And in this case, the effect size is 1 percentage point. Again, whether that's large or small depends on your tolerance for risk and your passion for red meat. That's a very personal decision. But again, it is your responsibility to consider both of those, let's say, numerics simultaneously. The 20% increase in relative risk, the 1% increase in absolute value of risk. Sometimes it's more useful to think about the relative, sometimes in terms of absolutes. I recommend that you simply report both and let the informed reader make the decision rather than making the decision for the reader. Unless you're trying to accomplish an objective. Unless you're trying to make an effect look as large as possible or as small as possible. Well, then you should be aware of these 2 alternate paths for making something look larger or smaller. Those techniques should be in your tool shed. I'm going to ask you to do something which I think will be very difficult. Just as in negotiation, sometimes an effective technique is to play dumb. And that technique comes with some difficulty for those who consistently excel in intellectual exercise. In the same way, I'm going to ask you to turn off your brain for a second and to stop thinking. Not yet, which may be a little bit challenging, but let's work through this together. When I say go, turn off your brain and answer the question which I'll pose. The question that I'll pose for you, there's going to be a squiggly line, a zigzagging line, the time series. And I'd like to ask you whether the trend in that time series, the trend in that zigzagging line, is generally positive or negative or flat. That's it. Is the zigzag on average, is it going up? Is it going down? Or is it staying relatively flat? Okay. That's what I'm going to ask you to do. Okay. Again, there's going to be a yellow, a tan time series, spiky graph. It'll look like a stock market series. And again, is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying flat? When I count to 3, I'd like to ask you to turn off your minds. Just share your impression. Be ready to type it out. So plus for going up on average, 0 for staying flat, minus for going down on average. And 3, 2, 1, turn off your minds. Zigzag, going up or down or flat. Plus, minus, or 0. Let's put it in the chat. Okay, mission accomplished. Everybody is putting a minus. Everybody sees The zigzag, everybody sees the time series going down on average, which is exactly what the author of this op-ed wants you to see. Let's look at the article. Forget the Amazon hype. So this was published during the raging fires in the Amazon in South America. Fires globally have declined 25% since 2003, thanks to economic growth. So two reasons why your sensors should be blinking like mad. One is it's an op-ed, so that's number one. Number two, because of the word thanks to. As soon as a monumentally complex effect like forest fires is meant to be explained causally with one factor, then you know immediately that there is a good degree of BS-ery and or attempted influence, probably not supported with statistical rigor. Anytime that somebody tries to talk about causality, you should ask them to pause and you can look at the data yourselves. But let's look at associations. From left to right, we have time, we have the year. On the vertical axis, we have a normalized index of how much fire is burning, what surface area of forest is being subject to conflagration. Now what I'd like you to do, you guys should start thinking again, right? The thoughtless part is over. Try to eliminate this red line from your subconscious, or actually from your conscious, from your visual field, and actually look at the time series, at the data. Look where it starts. It starts a little under 1, and it ends a little bit under 1. Well, I mean, that's it. If there were not a red line sloping downward in big, bold, and red, you would never have thought that there's a downward trend. This is one of the most common ways of how to lie with statistics. Simply take a line, slope it however you want to slope it, and then tell a story. And you're just scrolling through on your LinkedIn feed, on your Facebook feed, on your Twitter feed, whatever it is. You see the subject, you see the title, you see the graph, and now you believe something as fact. Maybe you tell somebody about it, and because you're a Wharton student, they believe you. And now there's a falsehood, which has now spread, if you'll pardon the pun, like wildfire. You know, if I'd wanted to, I could have started the red line at the bottom of 2004 to middle 2012 and 2013 and shown you the massive growth in forest fires due to insert reason. Or we could have started in 2004 and ended in 2014 and shown an even more massive decline. Or we could have been honest and started at the start of our time series, ended at the end of our time series, and shown an absolutely flat average behavior in forest fires. So the purpose behind this is to remind you the myriad ways in which people who want to influence you, who want to convince you, the measures that they will take to accomplish those ends. And even those of you who did spectacularly on your GMATs, some of you did very well in school or wherever you did in your place of work, still your instinct was to believe how they wanted you to believe. So there's no shortage of these examples and no shortage of these examples that we will go through and learn over the course of the semester. But I hope that this gives you some taste of some of the mechanisms of the presentation of data, for good or for ill, to conceal or to reveal. I'd like to pause, and you are now soon to be official Wharton students, which means that you have the right to know, the right to ask. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you have, either about statistics at Wharton or core at Wharton or education at Wharton. I did my PhD here from 2009 to 2014, have taught ever since. So next year will be my 12th year at Wharton, with Wharton. I should make that 13. I'm a statistician, not a mathematician. I deal in approximations. Sorry. What do you guys want to know about this? I love this place, and I know it pretty well.
I'd be curious for your view on kind of what we just experienced and how that compares to your typical classroom environment in Wharton, I guess, in this world where we're all on Zoom.
Do you mean, am I dull in actual class?
I mean, the sort of activities that you took us through in kind of interactions. There's basically, when we come to Wharton, is this what class runs like, or
I understand. I understand the question. So look, every professor has autonomy to run his or her class according to his or her strengths and passions and class receptiveness to those techniques. This is how I like to run class. I like to introduce again cases from the world as it is to motivate what we're going to learn that day. Right, today we didn't learn any formulas. We didn't learn any theory, which itself is essential in order to have the techniques and to understand their underpinnings. So in actual statistics class, we will dedicate time maybe to board work to understand the motivations for and the mathematical underpinnings of some of the ideas that we'll speak about. But there will be, I think, a happy balance between mathematical support and real world applicability, because I think that if you only speak about the world without understanding the mathematics, then you're a pop psychologist. Again, I love Malcolm Gladwell, but I don't know how much he knows about what he writes about. On the other hand, if you just know about the mathematics but can't speak about the world, then you should be a research professor, which there's a great need for, but not what you came to Wharton for. So there's going to be a very happy balance between practice, theory, motivations, and applications. Does that address the question as you hoped, or is there something more that you're curious about?
Yeah, thanks. I was, basically curious kind of how this compares to the real classroom experience. Yeah.
It's not meant to be that different. Ugo, you had a question.
I was going to ask more of a personal question. What's been your favorite, I guess, like moment or I guess general like event during your time teaching at Wharton?
It's something which happens every single year. There is some moment where we all get to know each other so well. I don't mean necessarily sharing what's in the inner recesses of our heart, but we understand the rhythms of statistics education so well that there comes a moment in every semester when the understandings are tacit and unspoken, and the students can anticipate where I am going and why. And at that moment, I know that you, the students, when you come across a bit of data when I'm no longer there alongside you, you will no longer need me. Sometimes it happens a little earlier, sometimes it happens a little bit later, but it happens every semester, and there's a magic in it.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Following on from that, if for those students who haven't studied statistics or maths in quite a long time and didn't have a particularly joyous experience with the GMAT, do you have any advice on how we could prepare so we can follow along in our classes?
I can only speak to statistics, although with some general advice as well. My happiest, at the end of every semester, students write reviews. The category review that is one of the most pleasing to receive is that this is the third time that I've taken statistics. I detested it the first 2 times, and I've had a religious conversion. It's pretty much a direct verbatim. There are a lot of people who have not had happy experiences with statistics, which is fine. I think that the way that statistics is taught in primary or secondary education is not necessarily the right way. It's usually dry, formula-driven, without appeal to its meaning or applications. And so don't let those previous experiences color your perception of how statistics will be taught here. It is important to have some mathematical facility. There is going to be a math for business camp, tutorial, what have you, during the summer preceding the start of formal classes. It's taught well. It's taught with an eye towards what you need to know. So I would simply focus and try to follow along and do a good job during that preparatory material. But besides that, just relax and have a good time. Again, we'll learn a lot regardless of how statistics might have been taught before.
Perfect. Thank you.
Of course.
Sorry, I'm wondering how big the classes are normally.
Depending on what subject it is. There are certain elective classes which might have 20 or 30. Statistics, which is a core class, somewhere between, let's say, 85 students per section, which I think is ideal for this kind of environment, because there's always somebody who has a good question to ask. There's always somebody who has an answer to give, which means that there's never going to be too long of a silence as we're interacting with each other. It also means that there's going to be light. It also means that when you come to a breakout session, there will be somebody who doesn't understand something that you do, and you'll have an opportunity to explain, or vice versa, right? Somebody who will be just a step ahead and can help explain, right, in their own words. Well, perhaps we can end with your comments in the chat about how you feel about gluten, or how you feel about gluten-free, and how scientifically founded it is, and how an 11-figure industry was born. Don't be shy. All of you are right. So in class, we'll learn about the scientific study which gave rise to the grist for marketers and food scientists to enable a multi-billion-dollar industry. And then we'll learn about a follow-up study that showed that except for the 1% of the population that have contraindications, gluten-free is just an expensive way to feel good about yourself. And on that note, thanks very much for the opportunity to share this time together. I very much hope that you'll be in my class in the fall of 2021, that will continue our exploration, that will continue our education. And again, from the bottom of my heart, congratulations to you on an extraordinary accomplishment of being admitted to and soon to become Wharton students. Take care, everybody.